Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Education USA sessions on graduate statements of purpose. Our today's guest is wonderful Carrie from Michigan State University, and she will hold this session. This is organized by Education USA centers in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I do hope you will enjoy the session. I know I will.
All right. Well, I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you so much to all of you for tuning in today and for registering to come and listen. My background is as an attorney and as someone who has worked for almost 15 years in admissions at the law college, mostly at Michigan State University. My role has been to work for about 10 of those years just with international students who were applying to our graduate programs, so our Masters of Law and other master's programs. And in the past 5 years or so, I've also been working with our Juris Doctor students, mostly American students, though certainly some international students as well. So I have spoken with applicants from all around the world about lots of different programs. And one of the things that is really critical in law school admissions is, of course, the personal statement or the applicant essay. So that's what we are going to focus on here today. I do tend to speak pretty quickly because I get excited about this topic. So if I'm going too fast, please feel free to flag me in the chat to tell me to slow down, and I promise that I will. I'm just really excited to be here, and again, I really appreciate the opportunity. I am going to turn on our PowerPoint now, so hopefully you can all see that. My goal, really, again, is to talk to you today about how do you create the most powerful personal statement for graduate school in the U.S., and certainly this would apply to undergrad studies as well. But coming from my background in the graduate or the professional schools, I'm focusing in really on that piece. Although again, applicable certainly to undergraduate studies as well. But before I go to that, I wanted to talk about first something I think that gives this great context, right? Which is, what does an admissions committee look for in an applicant, right? Because until you know that, it's hard to know why the personal statement is important. So these are just some of the things, right? Certainly every admissions committee, every school is different, but I think this will give you a pretty good across the board feel for what admissions committees are considering when they're reading your application, right? First and most critical, right, is can you succeed academically at this particular school, right? Different schools have different grading standards, different admission standards, different professors and teaching styles, right? A law school versus a medical school versus a veterinary school versus a sociology program all have very different ways in which they would view an applicant. But across the board, any of those schools are going to look at your application to say, can this person succeed here, right? The other thing that the schools will look for is, how do you add to our community? What's unique about you given your background, given your skills, given your other qualifications, right? Why do you feel like a good fit for this institution? How will you add to the community, right? I always tell applicants, and it sounds really silly, but imagine that the admissions process is sort of like dating, right? That you're kind of looking to see who it is who you want to ask to be, out on a date with you, right? You're not going to ask everybody. You're only going to ask the people who you really feel are a good fit for you. And the same is true of this, right? Just as you are only going to go to the school and sort of marry, if you will, right, the school that is the absolute right fit for you. But this is sort of the beginning of that process, right? So how do you add to our community? The other important piece of this, and sort of a similar piece, is how do you compare to others in the applicant pool, right? And that changes from year to year. So one thing that we are asked a lot by applicants and admitted students is, why would somebody with my scores have been admitted last year but not this year? Or why would somebody have been given a scholarship of X amount last year and not this year? Well, it's because every single year that applicant pool is changing, right? And that's something that is really important to recognize, that some years schools have really good admission years and other schools we don't, or other years we don't, rather. So it's really important to think about, your application in the context of everybody else who's applying in a given year. So if you know that there is a huge volume of students applying for your program in a certain year, your admission chances may not be better, they may not be worse. They could be better, they could be worse, right? So it's really important to always assume that you're in a really competitive admission cycle and prepare your application accordingly. And then the final thing, right, that all of us are looking to see is, why are you applying to this school? Why do you want to attend this school? We know, all of us know, and all of you know, right, that students are applying to multiple schools. That's no secret, and that's absolutely a good thing, right? Schools want to make sure that you are exploring all of your options. But we also want to know that there's a reason that you're applying to us, and we want to know what that reason is. So those are just some of the things that an admissions committee is looking for, right? The other thing that's not added here, but I think is also sort of inherent in what all of this talks about, is that we want to know that you can pay attention to directions and details, right, in the application process. So the personal statement is a piece of that. And I want to go into depth about what the role is for a personal statement, because I think that's really important. Not every school has in-person interviews. In fact, most schools don't, right? At the graduate level, I think you see a lot more of that than you do at the undergrad, but certainly across the board, I would say the majority of schools don't have interviews unless they're really small programs or super, super competitive schools. So the personal statement is often serving in place of an in-person interview, right? It's giving that school's admissions committee some really unique insights into who you are as a person and why you want to attend the school. Or if there is an interview process, it's giving that school background for an interview, right? It's giving them a place to start with their questions for you when you're talking. So think of this as very much your place to sell yourself, right? In an honest, obviously ethical way, right? But you want to make sure that you are putting putting your best foot forward, that you are putting everything you can into this statement to really make the case that you should be admitted, right? It's sort of like, if, again, if you're going to buy a house, right? You want to be the person who's putting in the best offer on that house so that you're the one who's able to buy it. And the same is true here. You want to be putting forward the best application so that you are the one offered admission. This is also the role of the personal statement, right? To give the admissions committee additional insight into you as a person, as an applicant, that maybe is again unique to you, right? Something that is not on your resume, not in your transcripts, not in other documents. It's something that you want them to know that they wouldn't otherwise know about you. So oftentimes in job interviews, one of the questions that I like to ask an applicant is, tell me something about yourself that's not on your resume, right? And this is sort of the same type principle. Tell us something about yourself that's not in your resume, it's not in your transcripts, may have nothing to do with you, in terms of what you've studied, but it's an insight into who you are, and again, why you would be a good fit for this school. And we'll talk a little bit more later about sort of how to present that information, but I think the key here, right, is that it's something extra that you can include, again, to give the application or the admissions committee the best possible insight into you. I think the other thing too that's really critical here is that grades and transcripts tell me, as I review your application, all about your past, right? They tell me how you've performed. They tell me that you were a good student, right? The majority of students are good students, right, when they're getting to the point of applying to graduate school. So at a certain point, that becomes almost a given, right? That once we see that credential evaluation report, once we see where you went to school, we've read your letters of recommendation, right? All of that is critical. The personal statement is going to give us a lot more information about what you're doing now, who you are now, and then about your future goals, right? The other thing that I think is tangential to this, but still really important, is that letters of recommendation are almost always required, right? The struggle that I think our international students have is that if you're coming from a smaller school or a smaller country, or you are coming from a place where maybe not all the people who are recommending you, are proficient writers in English, this is a great place for you to be able to tell us things that you wish your recommenders could tell us, right? Because that's something we see a lot, right? Which is that we have somebody who has this person who, is recommending them, but the person who's recommending them just can't express what it is that they want to express. Or the recommender is using a form recommendation letter and telling us the same thing about every applicant they might be sending to our school, right? So, letters of recommendation are a very different topic that I'm happy to answer questions about. But I think that the way that it relates to the personal statement, especially for you as international applicants, is that you want this personal statement to embody some of what those letters of recommendation should normally embody, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit. And because I'm sharing my screen, I can't see if there are questions. So if you don't mind just shouting out, Alexandra, if there are questions in the chat box, I'm happy to answer them as we go. I'm happy to take questions. Kind of the rules, right, or my rules in terms of details. I say all these things because these are the most common things that we see from applicants, and this is both domestic and international applicants. We see the same types of things. So number one, we see people who are clearly in a rush, right? And they're not taking the time to do their best work. If you're not taking the time to do your best work and really sitting down to take, hours to write this personal statement, it's not going to be what you need it to be. And keep in mind that the personal statement is often where maybe some of those additional scholarship dollars are going to come from, right? This is, again, a place where not every school uses the same rubric, right, to score applicants, but certainly this is a really critical piece of your application, and sometimes the most critical piece. And it's also the place where if a school is on the fence about admitting you or not admitting you, this can often be the place where their opinion is decided, right? So really, really critical to take the time to do your best work. I would start by creating an outline, right, about what you want to talk about, going from there to a draft, taking a break, right, coming back to it a day or two later, editing it yourself, and really just, making sure you've done everything you can to proofread, to spell check, to be clear about, all these different things. Take the time. The other thing that I would say, and again, related to taking the time, is that you really should be writing either a separate or at least a tailored personal statement for each school instead of using the same one for each school, right? So many students will use the same exact essay for every single school. And what you really want to do is to, it's fine to use a very similar essay, but include something that's unique to that school, right? Include at least a paragraph talking specifically about your link to that school. The other piece of this, of course, is to follow directions, right? If the school has very explicit limits on the number of pages, or has specific prompts they want you to use, or suggested prompts, or any other submission directions, make sure that you follow those without assuming that every single application has the same directions, because schools like to do their own thing, unfortunately or fortunately, right, depending on how you look at it. So that's really important. I am always amazed by the number of students who don't spell check and proofread their work. It's really important that you don't send something to a school that you've not spell checked, right? That simply is unacceptable, because that means that you're probably going to, if you're doing that at the admission stage, you'll be doing that at the class stage too, right? So schools want to make sure that you have taken the time to create a professional writing sample. I think it's really important, though, to note something, especially for our international applicants who are not native English speakers. Schools do not expect your English to be perfect, right? So there is a difference between having good and spell checked and proofread personal statements and having perfect personal statements, right? So by no means am I suggesting that there can't be errors, right, in the usage of English, but there's a very different, there's a huge difference in those errors versus careless errors, right? So two very different things. So please don't feel that you've got to be perfect with your English. Just make sure that you've spell checked, that you've proofread, right, that it all makes sense. The other thing that we see a lot is that students don't correctly list the school they're applying to. So for instance, somebody who's applying to Michigan State might write, I really have always wanted to go to the University of Washington, right? Right away there, I'm thinking, well, great, send us to the University of Washington, right? And it's a careless error because they probably are applying both places, which is fine. But again, it shows a lack of attention to detail, and it shows a carelessness, right? And especially at the graduate school level, for people studying to be lawyers or doctors or, master students, PhDs, whatever it is, right? Schools want to know that you can pay attention. The other thing too that I will point out that's really difficult, right, is that, and this is a great place to plug Education USA, because schools in the US have really confusing names, right? In most states, there is a university of, let's say, Kansas. There is a Kansas State University. There's a university here in Michigan, Western Michigan University. There's also Central Michigan University. There's also Northern Michigan University and Michigan State University, right? All these schools with very similar names, but they're different schools, right? And so we will often see applicants sending, an application to me at Michigan State, but they're mentioning the University of Michigan, which is a different school. Or we'll have applicants sending an application to Michigan State that they thought they were sending to the University of Michigan, and we sent it along to the University of Michigan to say, hey, this applicant didn't really intend for us to apply here. So it's really important to make sure that you are making sure that not only are you correctly listing the name of the school, that you know which school you're applying to, right? So doing the research and making sure that that's correct is really critical. Schools will always err on the side of letting you know, right? If a student applies to me and I know that they're intending to apply somewhere else, we will always let them know. But it's also good for you to make sure that you know where it is that you're applying to, right? Because there are so many schools, again, with very similar names. The other piece of this is that it's important to look to see if the school has suggested prompts for the personal statement. Some schools have very specific things they want you to write about. Others are very open-ended, right? So make sure that when you're reading the instructions, and again, this goes back to the detail piece, if there are prompts, you want to make sure that you're answering those prompts. So again, taking the time to do your research, all the different things that we've talked about. The other piece that's critical, I mean, all these things are critical, right? But something that is very critical is that you really should not have anybody else editing your work, right? This is meant to be your work. And so schools, oftentimes, at least we at the law school at Michigan State, we actually, when you're applying, we actually have it in our application to say, to our applicants that the personal statement needs to be your own written work, right? That is because whether it's a domestic student or an international student, we want to see how you write without help, right? Because in school, you're going to need to write without help. So again, this goes back to the idea that we would rather have your authentic writing than have somebody else edited for you or somebody else helped you write, because this needs to be your own work. If you are going to have somebody else help you write it, you could be borderline plagiarizing, right? Depending on how you are incorporating their work. Plagiarism, which of course is using the ideas or the speech of somebody else, is a really big deal here because you're not giving them credit for it and you're passing it off as your own. So it's really important to have your personal statement be your own without someone else's help. And that's true even if you are not a native speaker and you want to have someone who is a native speaker edit your work. We would rather see your authentic writing. Deadlines, really important. Obviously, you want to make sure that you're meeting all the deadlines. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that many schools, not all schools, but many schools, will allow you to submit what we call an addendum if needed or allowed. We'll talk a little bit later about what that means, but basically that's a place for you to explain things that you feel the school should know about your transcripts or something else that's important to you. So, going back to sort of these rules, right, and talking more specifically about style and content, again, use your authentic voice, right? This should sound like you. This should be you speaking to us. What does that mean? Well, it means generally, right, avoiding using a lot of quotes, a lot of literature references unless they're very meaningful to you. We have a lot of students who will write to us and they will spend half the essay quoting Aristotle or somebody else, some great thinker from history, which is great. They're all many great thinkers. We don't want to hear from them, right? We want to hear from you. So unless there is a really, really good reason that you want to use a quote, and of course cite the quote, right, or use a reference, you really shouldn't, right? Unless, of course, that is a prompt that the university has given you that they want you to use. Again, this needs to be you writing. I'd also advise writing the statement in English rather than translating it into English, just because, again, it's going to sound better because translation doesn't always work well, right? We all know that that's the case. So write it in English rather than writing it in your native language and then translating it into English. As I mentioned earlier, it's really good to include a paragraph about your reasons to applying to that specific school. Schools want to know that there's a reason that you're applying to them, right? And so this is your chance to do that. Some of the best ways to do that would be to, look at their list of professors within the department you're applying to, find one that has a similar research interest, right, or a similar background as you do academically, and speak specifically to the fact that you really look forward to working with that person, or talk about a certain program or class, or the location, or maybe your uncle went there, or maybe a good friend of yours, something that links you to that school, that lets them know that you've done that research and that you truly do have an interest. The other thing too that I would say is that this is not the place to request scholarship funds, right? The personal statement really should have nothing to do with your request for funding. Most students, whether they're domestic or international, are going to be seeking scholarship funds, right? Of course, that's sort of a given, but this is not the place to request that. And we'll talk about how you might consider doing that if you wanted to do it in a different way, but not in a personal statement. Okay, so before I keep going, are there any questions? Again, I can't see the Q&A box, and I just want to make sure I'm not skipping over anybody's questions.
There are actually no questions from students, but I have one question.
Sure. Yeah.
When you were talking about not allowing anybody to edit,
Mm-hmm.
what do you actually mean by that? Would you mean for example, EducationUSA centers are offering help in the sense that we read somebody's statements and heavily comment on them? Would that be considered?
I would check with each school. So I think that in a law school context, right, we generally prefer that, if you want to have somebody read it and just say to you, this is great, right, that's one thing. But somebody actually marking up the document, we really frown upon.
Okay.
I think generally in the graduate context, that's probably the case. I think it's always good for the applicant to know what the school's expectations are, because you could have some schools that say, yeah, that's great, we don't care, right? And you could have some schools that say, no, we don't want that. So I think an applicant should always take the responsibility of checking with the school to find out what's acceptable and what's not. I think my opinion, right, and I can only give my opinion here and tell you what we do at my particular at the law college. So this is not even Michigan State generally, right, but just at the law college. We generally prefer, if people want to have a reader, right, again, just to give an opinion of, hey, this is great, or no, don't send this, right, that's something, okay, but, commenting and adding commas and checking grammar, I would say no, but again, I think it falls to the individual school. Does that help?
Yes, and we do actually have in the meantime one more question from a student, and says, what would be the best introduction for the statement of purpose? Whether is it some general and formal introduction in our story, or should be based on more specific details to interest, commission, or comment? Okay,
so that's a great question, and actually that leads really well into the next slide. So I'll answer it as we go if that works for the student. So one of the questions that we get a lot is, what are the possible topics that students can use if the school doesn't give prompts for the essay, right? And I think whether you have a prompt or whether you don't, that opening paragraph is really key, because as the student points out, you could really take it in two very different directions, right? I think this is where that authentic voice piece is really important, because what you want to do is to really capture your reader's attention. I think my personal opinion, right, is that something very formal, saying my name is so-and-so and I was born in such and such a place and this is where I studied, is not a good and effective introduction, right? Because all of those things can be gleaned from the other parts of the application, right? So anything that really introduces you in that fashion and gives your sort of chronological history in whatever form, really I would say is not a good introduction. I would really start with something that talks about your passion for whatever the degree is that you're applying for, or the school, or the current job that you're doing and how it, how it piques your interest. Something that really shows the passion that you have for the topic or for the school, I think is important. But I don't think there's a general rule to say every student should start a personal statement in a certain fashion, right? Because again, we don't want it to be, we don't want every application to look the same or every personal statement to look the same. So I think every student needs to think about what's the best way to introduce that topic, right? So if I were to write an admissions essay, now to a law school, right? I might talk about a specific situation I had that really inspired me to move forward in my career to go to law school, right? Or if I were applying to medical school, I might talk about a situation that I had with the medical establishment, or a relative who went through, a really painful medical situation, right? And talk about how that inspired me. A lot of times it's people talking about some sort of personal prompt that leads them to that degree, if that makes sense. And I'm happy to keep talking about that later if people have additional questions. But some of the additional topics that we suggest would be, what are your professional goals? How will the degree help you meet those goals? What skills, talents, or abilities do you have that will help you succeed at the school and in the profession? What places, people, or events have shaped you, and how? And this is really that would be a good one in terms of that first paragraph, right? To even incorporate that into any of these prompts or any prompt that the school gives you, right? Because anything like that is always going to inspire that type of passion that we talked about. And I apologize, there's actually a typo in this next one. How did you arrive at the decision to earn this degree, right? What led you to this program, to this degree, to this decision? And then the final one, again, this is a really good one to use as a first paragraph or first portion to capture the reader. If you've had significant life experiences or hardships, how do those, and then your response to them, impact how you'll contribute to the classroom or institution and to the profession, right? So thinking about how those things can impact your desire to learn this particular content, or be at this particular school, or be in this particular profession. All of those things can be really good things to talk about in your personal statement. All right, so I want to move to the idea of an addendum, but before I do, if there are additional questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Not at the moment.
Okay, perfect. So the addendum is something that not everybody knows is a possibility, and I think it's something that's really a good idea to include in certain circumstances. So, the word addendum obviously means something that you're adding on, right? In this case, an addendum is something that you're adding to your application besides the personal statement. And the reason that you would do it would be to explain, let's say, poor test scores, poor grades, right? Or a grade that you're not proud of, or maybe you had one semester that you had really poor grades and then you recovered, and you want to tell the school that you're applying to why that was the case, right? So if there's something in your record that you feel needs explanation, this is a good place to do it. You want to, if you're going to do that, you want to let the school know why that happened and how you'll be successful at their institution. And that is a good way to do it, is by including this addendum. So you're not putting those things in the personal statement per se, you're adding a very short statement in addition to it, if the school allows it, right, that talks about those things. And I highly suggest that if there's anything at all that you want to explain, that you do include that. And then finally, again, this isn't particularly part of the personal statement, but related, and so I want to just mention, and I apologize, I couldn't get my accent mark to work over resume, but your resume. I want to talk about the resume because I think it's important, again, to talk about the things that we see that are critical for you to know, right? And again, this is a part of your application for most schools. That is an important piece of the puzzle about who you are. One of the things that we see a lot from international applicants is that there's an assumption that the school in the US will know certain details that we don't know, right? So for instance, if you worked at a very, very highly regarded government agency in your country, it might be very well known within your country or your region what that agency is, or who the director is who's writing a letter of reference. But in Wisconsin or Texas or Tennessee, we can't assume that the admissions officer reading your essay is going to know who that person is, what that agency is, or what the details are of the work, right? So it's important to put that in context when you're writing your resume, and to put the name of the agency, but then also to put a quick descriptor of what that is. The same is true of awards or scholarships or other things, right? Because again, at a national level for you or a regional level, it might be something very well known, but we can't assume that somebody in the States, especially at places that are getting a ton of international applications, is necessarily going to know what that is and why it's significant. And putting in that key information is going to help help your application. It's also important that unless you are applying to a field where that would be common, you're submitting your resume on plain paper with no bold colors. And then also to think about the fact that your resume should be in the American style, right? A lot of our international applicants will submit resumes that have their photo, that have their weight, their height, their marital status, all of those things in employment and education here, we cannot consider. It's illegal for us to consider many of those things. So don't put it on your resume because we really can't have the photos or the mention of the personal details on the resume. It's, you know, and that's where, right, in the personal statement, you certainly could mention, right, that you had this critical incident with your wife or your husband and it led you to law school or it led you to medical school, right? But on the resume, that really shouldn't be anything that's mentioned on a resume just because that's not something that's acceptable here in the state. The other thing that I just want to touch on, because again, it goes back to the personal statement or a version of the personal statement, a lot of people will ask about what happens if they're waitlisted. As some of you know, in the US, students may be admitted, may be denied, and they may be waitlisted, right? And waitlisted basically means that your application is held for a later date. You may be admitted toward the end of the admission cycle, you may not, right? If you are waitlisted, there are certain things that you can do that I think are really beneficial. Number one would be to submit a supplemental statement in writing, right? So not just something by phone, not just a quick email, but really an actual statement, right? Written out in a professional form that you're still interested in and why you're still interested. I'd also call or at least chat, right, depending on time zones, and ask to speak to an admissions representative to ask about the timeline for the wait list, right? Because I think, again, that shows your interest. It shows that you are, you know, really making an effort to research what the school is doing and to show your interest. But then you also have some answers as to when you might find out answers. And then finally, I would let the school know if it's your first choice, but you have deadlines from other schools that you need to meet. Because oftentimes, if you call a school and say, look, I've got until next week to, you know, make a decision for XYZ school, and I would really like to come to you, but I don't feel comfortable saying no to this other school. The school sometimes, not always, right, will be willing to say, well, gosh, you're so interested that we're going to move you to the top of the wait list, right? Or they may otherwise work with you. So I think that's really, really important. That was all I had in terms of slides, and I wanted to save a lot of time for answers. I'm happy to answer questions by email as well. My email address is here on the slide, but I'm here for questions. So what else can I answer for anyone?
While students are maybe writing their own questions in the chat box, I do have one question that I want to ask you that I usually get from students, and that is, should graduate statements of purpose or personal statements be extremely formal, or they could, in a way, tell a story, be like more like
kind of
a short
conversational
story or novel or something?
Yeah. So I think they certainly should not read like an academic paper, right? I mean, I do think that having it be less formal is good. On the other hand, I think that there is an expectation that within that sort of more conversational style, it's not too informal, right? So I think this speaks to a larger issue, right? Which is that when you're dealing with law schools or graduate schools or any school in the US, just as you would in any country, right? You want to make sure that you're referring to the administrators there not by their first names, right? So it's very different if you're a colleague, right? So if I'm talking to an EducationUSA advisor like you know, we're going to be going by first names as colleagues. But students, right, of course, are going to be referring to me as Dean Feeheley, or if speaking to a professor, Professor Feeheley, right? We've had a number of students who will email the dean at various institutions and call them by their first name, right? Which just really, any place in the world, right, is a no-no, right? And that certainly is the case here. So I think the same is true with personal statements. You want to have the right level of formality, right? And so it still includes being polite. It still includes you know, using appropriate language. We've had students swear in their personal statements, right? Use foul language, which is, yes, informal, right? But totally inappropriate. So you want to be conversational, you want to be informal, but you want to make sure that it's also professional. right? And I think that's the balance that we can all find. The other thing that we see too, right, is that especially right now, given the state of the world and given the state of government in a lot of the world, we have students who are very inspired politically, right, which is a really good thing. But again, right, it is absolutely fine to profess opinion, and we love when students profess their opinions, but doing so in a respectful way, without name calling, without, all those different things is really critical, because again, that's part of being professional, right? So I think it's absolutely fine to be somewhat informal, but again, I would say it's sort of in that middle ground between formality and informality is where you really want to be.
Diana she said that she had questions that got answered in the meantime.
Oh, okay, good.
But I have questions.
Okay, sure.
As an
Go for it.
EducationUSA advisor, I get a lot of questions, and then I feel this is the best way to
Yeah,
get students their
absolutely.
answers. What they say from the horse's mouth, right? What do you think when you get a personal statement or statement of purpose that really kind of mentions professors by name or courses by name, and like when they're so exact and so specific? What do you feel?
Mhm.
What do you think about them?
I think it depends on the context, right? I think it's pretty easy to tell if someone has included that just because they feel like they should or because they actually have that interest, right? So,
Okay.
for instance, um, I can speak to my experience at the law school, and there's one professor who directs our immigration law clinic, which is our one of the clinics that we offer as part of our curriculum. And she's quite well known. She's very passionate about what she does. And there are many, many students who are super interested in immigration law. And because of that, they will go to the website and they will look up our immigration law clinic and they will read about it. And so her bio is there and other things. So there are many times that a student will mention her name or mention that program, and it's very authentic, right? It makes sense that it's there because their whole personal statement, they've been talking about wanting to do immigration law, and then suddenly, oh, and I want to work with this professor, right? So it really makes sense. On the other hand, there are students who talk about how they want to study contracts law, right? Again, using the law school as an example. And at the very end of the essay, they mentioned, oh, and I want to take this particular, criminal law course with this particular professor who studied at such and such place, and oh, it's such a good course. And it just doesn't fit, right? So I think it's okay to mention if it's in context, right? Or if you have a really deep passion for a particular course and that course is offered, that topic is offered, I think it's okay to mention it, but it shouldn't, it should be presented in a way that, again, it's authentic and it makes sense in the context of how you're writing it, right? If it's just thrown in there and it's clearly thrown in there, that is very different than being intentionally included and in a context.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
No more questions from students, and you
Okay.
actually answered some of my frequently asked questions by
Excellent.
students.
So I would say kind of in conclusion, right, I think that the one of the things that I want to emphasize, right, is that schools want your questions, right? We really, really do. We would much rather that we spend time with you on the phone or on email or on, FaceTime or whatever, talking through your questions about how to do these things than for you to make assumptions about what you think is wanted. Every school has different opinions about how things should be done, and every field has different expectations, right? So again, law different than medicine, different than history, right? So I would really encourage students to create a relationship with admissions representatives at the schools that they are applying to, because not only does that help them become familiar with you and show your interest in the process, but it also then gives you an entry point to that school to ask questions and to make sure that that you are submitting the best possible application. Most schools will have webinars or other presentations that are about personal statements or about standardized tests or other things. So definitely register for those things and listen to what the reps from those schools have to say, because in the end they're the ones who are going to be reading those essays and making decisions on the application.
When you mentioned this, Natalie's asking a question: what size should the statement be?
What size? So I would say no more than 2 pages, double spaced, if possible, but every school will generally have their own rules and tell you the maximum or the minimum. So I would certainly look at those requirements. If it doesn't say it, I would ask the school and say, what do you recommend? Because some will have very different answers, right? And some, again, some degree programs will have very different requirements. If you're applying to a PhD program, right, you're going to submit something very different than if you're applying for a master's in chemistry, right? So every field and every school is going to have slightly different requirements. But generally, for most fields, especially like in humanities, English, I would say 2-ish pages is a pretty good place to start.
Okay. Thank you, Natalie, for your question. I do have one more question that is actually quite related to what you just said previously. We as advisors, we usually recommend and ask students to contact their schools in advance to, say, to demonstrate their interest and, to start some communication between them. But I usually tend to tell them, read the website first.
Yeah.
And our golden rule is like, if you can find it in 2 clicks, don't ask. Like that means you didn't do your homework. So then what kind of questions are good to start conversation? Like they can read everything on the website, find lots of things, but they want to get in touch, for example, with you. How?
Well, I think that it doesn't necessarily need to be about the application, right? I mean, I think that's key here, right? Because you're right, so much about the application is online. So calling a school to say, what's your deadline? It doesn't make sense, right? Or emailing a school to ask that, it doesn't make sense because it's out there. But calling a school to say, can I set up a time to talk to an advisor? I'm really interested in your program. And then asking that advisor, I'm really interested in this particular, degree program, and these are my qualifications. Can you tell me more about, what else I might do this year to best prepare for, attending your school? Or can you put me in touch with a current student is a really good one, right? Because then you're not really asking questions about the application. You're not really asking questions that are already on the website. You're asking to be put in touch with someone who is already there, right? Or, I'm wondering how many students from my country attend your institution? Or do you have student groups that that represent my country or my region, right? So like at the school that I'm at, Michigan State, I think there are 500 and some student groups, right? So many of them are international student groups and focus on, the culture and the, traditions, right? So that you can celebrate holidays away from home and all those different things and have celebrations. So you could say, do you have a student group from such and such country or representing such and such religion, right? And can you put me in touch with them? I think that's always a good one, right? Because it shows you're interested, you're asking for a resource, but you're also not asking a question that's answered someplace on the website, right? It could also be, especially right now with the situation as it is in COVID, most schools have online courses. And so it could be, I'm exploring your school. Is it possible for me to sit in virtually on a class? Right, which is another way to get to know the school, but it's not something that's on the website necessarily. Or hey, I've looked at your website. I'm really interested in learning more about this particular part of the program. Could you put me in touch with one of the professors who teaches in that program? Right. I mean, I think there's lots of ways to do it. But certainly some schools' websites are not clear as it relates to the application, right? I mean, we try really hard, but not always, right? So I think that's a good place to say, I did have these questions about the application and here's what they are. One of the things that I would err against, that I would strongly advise against, is sending a school an email with a ton of questions, right? If you have a ton of questions, send an email saying, can I set up a time to talk to somebody? And then talk through those questions, because all of us, right, no matter who we are, what profession, if we get an email with a ton of questions that we have to answer, especially if those are questions that are answered on the website or in another resource, it's frustrating and very, very time consuming, right, to have to go through. So many schools, instead of answering all those questions, will say, let's just set up a time to talk. It's better if you are the one as the applicant saying, I have a bunch of questions, can I set up a time? But certainly if it's 1 or 2 questions, I think that's very different, right, to just send an email.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. If anybody else has questions, you've got my email address, and I'm happy to answer via email or set up a time to talk to people individually. So I really appreciate everybody coming today.
Thank you very much, and we'll keep in touch.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.